Today, we're going to talk about the signs of autism in adults that we so often miss. And here's a little fact to get us started. Statistically, there was likely more than one autistic person in any classroom you've ever been in. See, they've been here the whole time. We're just now, finally, learning what to look for.
So, let me just ask you something straight up. Do you ever get that feeling that you're just speaking a completely different language than everyone around you? Like everyone else got handed a secret rule book for life, and yours got lost in the mail or something?
Well, that exact feeling is incredibly common for undiagnosed autistic adults. And the reason it goes undiagnosed so often is because we're all kind of working off old stereotypes. But the real signs, well, they can be much more subtle and, honestly, a lot more surprising. So let's unpack them.
First up, let's talk about the external stuff. This is all about how the internal experience of being artistic shows up on the outside, especially in social situations and in the need for structure.
For a lot of people, social interaction just isn't intuitive. It's like having to manually process thousands of tiny little cues that everyone else seems to get automatically. And that, as you can imagine, is completely exhausting. So it's no wonder that it can lead to avoiding social events, or maybe coming off as a little awkward, or even just deciding to ditch the rulebook and seeming eccentric. At its heart, though, it's a core difficulty in just fitting in.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because a need for structure can actually look like two completely opposite things. On one hand, you might have someone who is super organized with really rigid routines, and on the other, you could have someone who seems totally chaotic and all over the place. But here's the thing, they're often two sides of the very same coin. Both are coping mechanisms for managing something called executive function. Without an external structure, the brain can just feel infinitely chaotic. So that extreme organization, it's really just a defense against the chaos.
Okay, so we've touched on the external world. Now let's dive into the internal experience. This is all about how the world is perceived through the senses and how skills can show up in some pretty unusual ways.
When you hear sensory sensitivity, your mind probably jumps to light and sound, right? But it's so much broader than that. It can mean having a really high or really low tolerance for pain, or having trouble regulating your body temperature. It can even affect your coordination. You know, there's a reason clumsiness can be an autistic trait. It's often a sensory issue tied to something called proprioception, which is just a fancy word for your brain's internal GPS of where your body is in space. If that system's a little off, of course you're going to have a challenge with coordination. And this right here perfectly illustrates the idea of a spiky skill set. Instead of having abilities that are kind of level across the board, an autistic profile often shows these huge spikes of natural talent in some areas, and then these deep valleys of real struggle in other areas that most adults find pretty simple.
Here's a real-world example of one of those spikes. The person in the source material was okay at tennis, sure, but when it came to table tennis, he was just naturally, effortlessly better than everyone else. So much better, in fact, that he had to start playing with his non-dominant hand just to make it a fair game. That's a spike.
And here's the other side of that, a deep valley. Now, for most of us, ordering food from a QR code menu is, a minor inconvenience. But for some people, the sheer amount of executive function that it takes to do that multi-step process is so overwhelming, they would literally rather go hungry. And it's that extreme contrast that's really key here. So what happens when all of this, the sensory issues, the social challenges, the executive function struggles, just becomes too much? Well, that brings us to emotional regulation.
Let's just define this in the simplest way possible. It's about that exact moment, that feeling when the world is just too much, and you feel like you absolutely cannot take it anymore. What happens next?
For a lot of autistic people, the response can seem pretty binary. It might be a meltdown, that's an external breakdown, an explosion of feeling. Or it could be a shutdown, which is when the brain's circuit breaker just flips. Everything goes offline. No information in, no information out. Or it could be a more deliberate withdrawal, just pulling back from the world to try and save some energy.
But it doesn't always have to be so extreme. A great example of a more subtle form of regulation is literally taking a power nap. At a party, in the middle of all the noise and people, you just find a corner, close your eyes for 20 minutes, and completely reset your brain. That's a coping mechanism.
Now, when you put all this together, it naturally leads to a fundamentally different way of thinking. This is about how the autistic brain can make these absolutely fascinating, uncommon connections between ideas. This quote just sums it up perfectly. To an outsider, that jump from banana to space station seems totally random, right?
But for the person who made that connection, there's a perfectly clear logic to it, even if it's 5 steps removed from where the conversation started.
So what makes an association unusual? Well, it's all about comparing it to the norm. Studies have shown that if you ask a bunch of people to name a random vegetable, most of them will say carrot or potato. But when a friend of the person in our source material was asked, he said rhubarb. And that's it, right there. That's the perfect example of a brain that just naturally zigs where everyone else zags.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, but this all brings us to the final sign. And in some ways, it's actually the simplest and most powerful one of all.
It all boils down to this: a consistent feeling of just being different. You might not even be able to put your finger on why. It could be a good different, a quirky different, but our brains are pattern recognition machines. We're built to spot what fits and what doesn't. And if this is resonating with you, if you have consistently felt like the odd one out across all sorts of different groups and situations your entire life, that feeling itself is a huge sign. It's that feeling of not quite fitting in no matter how hard you try. This is why finding the autistic community can be such a surreal and validating experience. You walk into a room and suddenly you realize you are surrounded by people who are also a bit different, each in their own special way. And that thing that always made you feel like an outcast, it's now the very thing that connects you to everyone else.
And that leaves us with one final thought to ponder. If being different is what makes you the odd one out, what happens when you find a place where everyone is? Well, ironically, no one is. And that might just be the very definition of belonging.